April 1st, 1945. Dawn breaks over the East China Sea, painting the waters around Okinawa in shades of amber and crimson. On the beaches of Hagushi, the sound begins, a rumble that seems to emerge from the earth itself, growing louder with each passing second. It is not thunder. It is the sound of 1,400 Allied ships unleashing 40,000 tons of naval artillery upon the limestone cliffs and coral ridges of Japan's southernmost prefecture. In the holds of transport vessels, young American Marines clutch photographs from home, their fingers trembling not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that they are about to set foot on Japanese soil for the first time in this war. The air smells of cordite and salt. Somewhere in the hills above those beaches, Lieutenant Tadashi Kojo of the Imperial Japanese Army writes in his diary, "Today, we become the shield of the homeland. Today, we learn what it means to be eternal." He does not know that within 82 days, 94,000 of his countrymen will be dead. He does not know that the island he has sworn to defend will become the bloodiest battlefield in the Pacific War. And he does not know that the world is watching Japan make a choice between surrender and annihilation. A choice that, for reasons woven deep into the fabric of Japanese culture and wartime ideology, is no choice at all. This is the story of why nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers on Okinawa chose death over capture. It is not a story of madness, though it may seem so from a Western perspective. It is a story of indoctrination, of cultural values twisted into weapons, of young men who believed their lives were worth less than the honor of their emperor. It is a story that begins not on the beaches of Okinawa in 1945, but in the centuries of tradition that taught a samurai that death was preferable to shame, and in the decades of militarism that transformed an ancient code into a modern nightmare. To understand what happened at Okinawa, one must first understand what Japan had become by April of 1945. The nation that had once sought to build an empire, stretching from the Aleutian Islands to Australia, was now a fortress under siege. American bombers had reduced Tokyo to ashes. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, rested in pieces on the ocean floor from Midway to Leyte Gulf. On every front, Japanese forces were in retreat, their supply lines severed, their soldiers starving on forgotten islands while American submarines prowled the waters, sinking every vessel that dared to sail. But Japan did not surrender, could not surrender, according to the logic that governed its military and political elite. Since 1868, when the Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan from a feudal society into an industrial power, the nation had adopted a unique fusion of ancient warrior traditions and modern nationalism. At its core was the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, a belief that the Japanese people possessed a unique spiritual essence that made them superior to other races and destined to lead Asia. This ideology was not mere propaganda. It was taught in schools, preached in temples, and reinforced by every institution of Japanese society. The military had taken this ancient spirit and weaponized it. The warrior code of Bushido, once the ethical framework of the samurai class, had been resurrected and distorted to serve the needs of total war. Where historical Bushido emphasized loyalty, honor, and self-discipline, the militarized version of the 1930s and 1940s reduced these complex virtues to a single imperative: die for the emperor. Japanese soldiers were taught from their first day of training that surrender was not merely defeat, it was the ultimate betrayal of everything that made them Japanese. The Senjin-kun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, issued in 1941, made this explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor. By 1945, this ideology had curdled into something darker. As defeat became inevitable, the Japanese military hierarchy embraced a doctrine known as Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. The phrase came from ancient Chinese texts and referred to the idea that it was better to be a shattered jewel than an intact tile. Better to die gloriously than to live in dishonor. What had once been a poetic metaphor became military policy. On islands across the Pacific, Japanese commanders ordered their men to fight to the last man, to take as many American lives as possible before their own inevitable deaths. Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, each became a monument to this philosophy of death. Okinawa would be the culmination of everything Japan had learned about dying. The Japanese soldiers who dug into the hills and caves of Okinawa in the spring of 1945 were not the same men who had conquered Malaya and humiliated the British at Singapore. They were younger, less trained, more desperate. Many had been conscripts for less than a year. Farmers and fishermen pressed into service as the empire's manpower reserves dwindled to nothing. They wore uniforms that no longer fit properly because the factories that made them had been bombed into rubble. They carried rifles that jammed because quality control had collapsed. They were given rations calculated to last 3 months, though their commanders knew the battle would not last that long, not because Japan would win, but because every man defending the island was expected to die before 3 months had passed. Yet these men believed. They believed because they had been told every day of their service that the emperor was a living god, that Japan had never lost a war in its 2,600-year history, that death in battle would transform them into spirits who would be enshrined at Yasukuni and honored forever. They believed because they had been shown photographs, fabricated or carefully selected, of American soldiers committing atrocities against Japanese prisoners, told that capture meant torture and execution. They believed because to doubt was treason, punishable by death at the hands of the Kempeitai, the military police who watched for any sign of weakness or defeatism. These young men expected in their final days to die as their ancestors had died, with swords in their hands, facing the enemy, earning glory that would echo through generations. What they did not expect was the nature of the enemy they were about to face. When the American Marines came ashore on April 1st, they brought with them a material abundance that seemed almost obscene to the Japanese defenders watching from the hills. The initial landings were unopposed, part of Japanese General Mitsuru Ushijima's strategy to let the Americans land before engaging them in the fortified positions further inland. As the Marines moved across the beaches, the Japanese soldiers witnessed something that shook their understanding of warfare: the sheer quantity of everything the Americans possessed. Within hours, the beaches were transformed into supply depots that dwarfed anything the Japanese military had ever assembled. Mountains of ammunition crates stacked 20 feet high, field kitchens serving hot meals to thousands of men, bulldozers and earth movers reshaping the landscape, trucks, so many trucks, moving in endless columns. Medical stations with more supplies than an entire Japanese field hospital, and the food. The Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been surviving on rations of rice and pickled vegetables so meager they left men weak and malnourished, watched through binoculars as American soldiers ate from tins of meat, fruit, chocolate, and bread that seemed to be in limitless supply. Corporal Masao Yoshida, in a diary recovered after the battle, wrote, "They land on our shores as if they own the island already. They do not creep or hide. They walk in the open, knowing their ships and planes will protect them. Each of their soldiers carries more food in his pack than our entire company receives in a week. How does one fight an enemy who has so much? How does one defeat a nation that can waste more than we can produce?" This was the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War laid bare. Japan, an island nation with limited resources, was fighting America, a continental power with seemingly infinite industrial capacity. By 1945, the United States was producing more aircraft in a month than Japan had built in the entire war. American shipyards were launching an aircraft carrier every 6 weeks. The average American soldier in the Pacific received 33 pounds of supplies per day. The average Japanese soldier received 2 pounds, and often less. But the abundance was not merely material. The Japanese soldiers also witnessed something that contradicted everything they had been taught about American soldiers. They had been told that Americans were soft, decadent, individualistic, lacking the spiritual strength to endure sacrifice. They had been assured that Americans would quit after the first hard blow, that American democracy was a weakness that would crumble under pressure. What they saw instead were men who fought with a coordination and effectiveness that came not from fear of punishment, but from genuine unit cohesion. American soldiers who retreated when ordered without shame because tactical withdrawal was understood as sometimes necessary. Medics who rushed into fire to save wounded comrades, a concept that had been drummed out of Japanese military doctrine as sentimental weakness. And perhaps most jarring of all, they saw African American and Japanese American soldiers fighting in American uniforms, evidence that the enemy they faced was not a monolithic racial entity, but a diverse coalition held together by something other than blood and soil. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was, from a tactical perspective, brilliantly conceived. General Ushijima had learned from the failures of previous island defenses. Instead of trying to stop the Americans at the beaches, where naval gunfire would annihilate any concentration of troops, he ordered his forces to retreat into the southern portion of the island, where limestone ridges and coral caves created a natural fortress. The defensive line centered on Shuri Castle, an ancient Okinawan structure that had been transformed into a warren of tunnels and bunkers. From these positions, the Japanese inflicted horrific casualties on the advancing Americans. Every hill became a killing ground. Every cave had to be cleared with grenades and flamethrowers. The Marines gave these positions names that reflected their terrible cost. Sugarloaf Hill, where 3 Marine regiments were ground to pieces over 10 days of fighting. Half Moon Hill, Horseshoe Ridge. Each name marked a location where hundreds died for yards of ground. But the Japanese could not win. They could only kill and die. And as the weeks wore on, as American firepower slowly reduced their fortified positions to rubble, as supplies ran out and the wounded accumulated in the caves with no hope of evacuation or proper treatment, the Japanese soldiers faced a truth their training had not prepared them for. Dying gloriously in battle was not glorious at all. It was terror and pain and chaos. Men were not cut down cleanly in dramatic charges. They were buried alive in collapsed tunnels. They starved slowly in sealed caves. They died of infected wounds because there were no medical supplies. They were incinerated by flamethrowers or blown apart by artillery they never saw coming, and yet they did not surrender. The mass charges came in the final weeks of the battle as the Japanese defensive perimeter collapsed and coherent military resistance became impossible. These were not the calculated banzai charges of earlier battles, designed to achieve tactical objectives. These were acts of desperation and ideology made manifest. Groups of soldiers, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, sometimes just a dozen men, would emerge from the caves at night and throw themselves at American positions with whatever weapons they still possessed. They came with rifles that had no ammunition, swinging them as clubs. They came with bamboo spears. They came with grenades clutched in their hands, hoping to take an American with them when the explosive detonated. They came knowing they would die, because death was now the only option their code permitted. Lieutenant Paul Dunphy of the 1st Marine Division described one such charge in his after-action report. They came out of the darkness screaming, not in rage, but in what sounded almost like grief. We cut them down with machine gun fire before they got within 50 yards of our line. In the morning, we counted 73 bodies. Not one had managed to reach our position. Not one had inflicted a single casualty. But they had tried, every last one of them, to die taking an enemy with them. The Americans, for their part, struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Marine veterans of Guadalcanal and Tarawa had seen Japanese soldiers fight ferociously, had respected them as dangerous and skilled opponents. But what was happening at Okinawa seemed to transcend military logic entirely. It was, in the words of one Marine officer, like fighting men who had already decided they were dead. American commanders tried to encourage surrenders. Leaflets were dropped over Japanese positions promising good treatment for prisoners. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese explaining that the war was lost, that surrender was not shameful, that families in Japan wanted them to live. These efforts saved some lives. Over the course of the battle, approximately 7,000 Japanese soldiers were captured, a much higher number than in previous battles. But for every man who surrendered, 13 chose death. The symbol that came to represent the unbridgeable gap between American abundance and Japanese deprivation was not a weapon or a battle standard. It was food. Specifically, it was a can of peaches. American K rations included small tins of fruit, peaches, pears, fruit cocktail, packed in sweet syrup. To American soldiers, these were barely worth mentioning, sometimes traded away for cigarettes or simply discarded. To Japanese soldiers, slowly starving in their caves, these cans became objects of almost mythological significance. Stories circulated among the Japanese defenders of soldiers who had ventured out at night to scavenge American supply dumps and had been killed clutching cans of peaches, of men who had eaten canned fruit for the first time in their lives, minutes before dying. One captured Japanese soldier, when asked why he had finally surrendered, replied through a translator, "I watched my friends die for 3 months. We had no food, no water, no hope. Then I found a can of peaches in a destroyed American position. I ate them, and I thought, a nation that gives its soldiers fruit in tin cans cannot be defeated. What are we dying for?" The peaches became a ghost in the narrative of Okinawa. They appeared in letters, in interrogation reports, in the journals of both American and Japanese soldiers. They represented not just American material superiority, but a fundamental difference in how each nation valued its soldiers' lives. America sent its sons to war with peaches in their rations. Japan sent its sons to war, expecting them never to return. As the battle entered its final phase in late May and early June, the Japanese command structure began to collapse. General Ushijima remained in his headquarters beneath Shuri Castle, continuing to issue orders even as his army disintegrated around him. His strategy had achieved its goal. Okinawa had been the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, with American casualties exceeding 50,000. But achieving tactical success within the framework of inevitable defeat was no victory at all. It was merely a very expensive way of dying. On June 18th, with organized resistance at an end and American forces closing in on his final headquarters, General Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, knelt on a cliff overlooking the ocean and committed seppuku, ritual suicide. Before his death, Ushijima composed a final poem, "Green grass wilts and the autumn leaves fall, all a dream within a dream." His death marked the official end of Japanese military resistance, but the killing continued. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, now without orders or leadership, continued fighting from isolated caves and hillsides. Some fought alone, some in groups of 2 or 3. They had no mission except to die. And die they did, in ones and twos and dozens, through June and into July, until the island was declared secure on July 2nd, 1945. The final count was staggering. Of the approximately 100,000 Japanese military personnel on Okinawa at the start of the battle, over 94,000 died. The surrender rate was less than 7%. This was not merely low by Western standards, it was unprecedented in modern warfare. No other military force in World War II, facing comparable circumstances, came close to such a death rate. German and Italian forces surrendered in large numbers when situations became hopeless. Even Soviet soldiers, fighting under one of the most brutal regimes in history, surrendered at far higher rates when encircled or cut off. The Japanese soldiers at Okinawa had chosen differently. They had chosen the shattering of the jewel. But the story of Okinawa is not complete without acknowledging the third tragedy that unfolded alongside the military battle, the fate of the Okinawan civilian population. Okinawa was not just a military outpost. It was home to nearly 500,000 civilians who had lived for centuries in a distinct culture, separate from mainland Japan, with their own language and traditions. These people found themselves trapped between 2 armies, and the Japanese military's treatment of them revealed the darkest aspects of imperial ideology. Japanese commanders had indoctrinated civilians with the same propaganda that had shaped their soldiers' worldview. Okinawans were told that American soldiers would commit unspeakable acts against prisoners. Women were given grenades and told to kill themselves and their children rather than be captured. Young men were pressed into service as laborers and given no option to refuse. When civilians tried to flee the fighting or sought refuge in the same caves where Japanese soldiers hid, they were sometimes driven out at gunpoint by those same soldiers or killed as potential spies. The result was a civilian casualty rate that approached 1/3 of Okinawa's population, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 dead. Families threw themselves from cliffs. Mothers killed their children and then themselves. Entire communities vanished in acts of mass self-destruction that they had been convinced were necessary to preserve their honor. When American forces finally reached these civilians, when Okinawan families emerged from caves expecting torture and death and instead received food, medical care, and safe passage to refugee camps, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. American medics treated Okinawan wounded alongside their own. American soldiers shared their rations with starving families. These acts of basic humanity, not mercy, but simple recognition that civilians were not combatants, began to crack the edifice of lies that Japanese propaganda had constructed. One Okinawan civilian, a school teacher named Masahide Ota, who survived the battle and later became a historian, wrote, "We had been taught that the Americans were demons. When they gave us food and treated our wounded, we did not know what to believe anymore. If they had lied about this, what else was a lie?" The question haunts us still. Why did 94,000 Japanese soldiers choose death over surrender? The easy answer, that they were brainwashed, that they were fanatics, that they were somehow fundamentally different from soldiers of other nations, is both true and incomplete. Yes, Japanese military indoctrination was extraordinarily effective. Yes, the cultural and historical context of Japan created conditions that made such behavior possible. But to stop there is to miss something more profound about what human beings are capable of believing and what they are capable of doing when those beliefs are manipulated by authority. The Japanese soldiers at Okinawa were not born wanting to die. They were taught to want it. They were shaped by a system that began in childhood and continued through every institution of Japanese society. Schools that taught unquestioning loyalty to the emperor, religious traditions that were twisted to serve nationalist purposes, military training that used brutality to break down individual identity and replace it with group loyalty, and propaganda that painted surrender as a fate worse than death. But they were also shaped by circumstances. By 1945, many Japanese soldiers on Okinawa knew that their families at home were suffering from American bombing raids. They knew that surrendering would not save Japan. The war was already lost. If death was inevitable, if their families would die anyway, then at least they could die in a way that aligned with the values they had been taught since childhood. At least they could believe their deaths had meaning. And there was another factor, spoken of less often, but present in the testimonies of those few who did surrender: fear. Fear not just of the Americans, but of their own comrades and commanders. Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender were sometimes shot by their own officers. Those who expressed doubt or war weariness risked being beaten or executed. The military police were ubiquitous and merciless. Survival sometimes meant pretending to embrace death more fervently than one's comrades, lest suspicion fall on you. In the end, the mass charges at Okinawa were not acts of courage, though many of the men who participated in them were certainly courageous. They were acts of desperation by men who had been systematically stripped of choices. They were the product of an ideology that valued collective honor over individual lives. They were the result of a military culture that had convinced young men that their lives were worth less than the abstract concept of the nation. They were, in the most fundamental sense, a tragedy. After Okinawa fell, American strategists looked at the casualty figures and shuddered. If this was what it cost to take one island, if this was the price of securing a staging ground for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, then what would the invasion itself cost? Estimates ranged from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties, military and civilian, were projected in the tens of millions. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 must be understood in this context. The American decision to use nuclear weapons was driven in significant part by the lessons of Okinawa. If Japanese soldiers on an outlying island had fought with such fanaticism, what would Japanese soldiers defending Tokyo do? If Japanese commanders had been willing to sacrifice every man on Okinawa, what would they do when the emperor's palace itself was threatened? The bombs, terrible as they were, offered a way to end the war without an invasion. They provided the Japanese leadership with a face-saving excuse to surrender. They could claim that no human force could resist such weapons, that continuing to fight was impossible, not dishonorable. Emperor Hirohito, in his surrender broadcast, specifically mentioned a new and most cruel bomb as justification for accepting the Potsdam Declaration. But even after the bombs fell, even after the emperor himself commanded surrender, some Japanese soldiers refused. On Okinawa and other islands, small groups of holdouts continued fighting for months, even years. The last confirmed Japanese holdout, Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, did not surrender until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended. These men had internalized the code so completely that even Imperial command could not override it. The story of Okinawa is carved now in stone and memory. There are monuments on the island listing the names of the dead, American, Japanese, and Okinawan. There is a museum where visitors can see the artifacts of the battle, the rusted rifles, the helmets, the letters home that were never sent. There is a peace memorial park, where the names of all who died, regardless of nationality, are inscribed on black granite walls that face the sea. But the deeper legacy of Okinawa is more complicated. In Japan, the battle became a symbol of the madness of militarism, evidence of what happens when a nation's leaders value ideology over life. The Japanese soldiers who died at Okinawa are remembered not as heroes who defended the homeland, but as victims of a system that sent them to die for a war already lost. Their sacrifice is honored, but it is honored with sorrow and regret, not with pride. In America, Okinawa is remembered as the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, the battle that convinced American leadership that invading Japan would be too costly, the battle that helped justify the use of atomic weapons. It is taught in military academies as an example of the terrible cost of enemy fanaticism and the importance of understanding the psychology of one's opponent. For Okinawans themselves, the battle remains a wound that has never fully healed. Their island was devastated. Their culture was nearly destroyed. And in the aftermath, Okinawa became home to major American military bases that remain to this day, a lasting reminder that the war may have ended, but its consequences persist. What can we learn from the fact that 94,000 young men chose death over surrender? What does it teach us about human nature, about the power of ideology, about the responsibility of governments to their citizens? First, it teaches us that human beings are not born with fixed beliefs about honor, death, or sacrifice. These concepts are culturally constructed and can be manipulated. The Japanese soldiers at Okinawa were not inherently different from American or British or Soviet soldiers. They were shaped by a specific historical context, and under different circumstances, they would have made different choices. Second, it teaches us about the danger of ideologies that demand absolute loyalty and define dissent as betrayal. When a system of belief becomes so rigid that it cannot tolerate doubt, when it equates surrender with dishonor so completely that death becomes preferable, when it teaches young people that their individual lives matter less than collective abstractions, that system will inevitably produce tragedies like Okinawa. Third, it teaches us about the importance of material abundance and the provision of basic needs in undermining totalitarian ideologies. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered often cited the evidence of American plenty, the food, the medical care, the basic respect for human life, as the reason they began to question what they had been taught. When ideology contradicts lived experience too dramatically, ideology begins to crack. And finally, it teaches us that wars are not just fought between armies. They are fought between competing visions of how society should be organized, what values should govern human behavior, what purpose an individual life should serve. The Japanese soldiers at Okinawa died for a vision of society in which the individual existed only to serve the collective, in which honor mattered more than survival, in which death could be beautiful if performed correctly. The Americans who opposed them fought, however imperfectly, for a vision in which individual lives had inherent worth, in which surrender was not shameful but pragmatic, in which freedom meant the right to choose one's own path, even if that path led away from the battlefield. The sun sets over Okinawa now, as it did in April of 1945, painting the waters in shades of amber and crimson. The beaches where the Americans landed are peaceful. The ridges where men fought and died are covered in vegetation. The caves where Japanese soldiers made their last stands are empty, marked with signs warning visitors away from unstable terrain. But if you stand on those beaches at dawn, if you watch the sun rise over the East China Sea, you can almost hear them still. The sound of 1,400 ships, the roar of artillery, the voices of young men in two different languages, both believing they were right, both believing they were fighting for something larger than themselves. 94,000 Japanese soldiers chose death over surrender at Okinawa. They made that choice not because they were monsters or fanatics or fundamentally different from any other human beings, but because they were the products of a system that had taught them from childhood that death with honor was better than life with shame. They died believing they were protecting their homeland, serving their emperor, upholding the traditions of their ancestors. They died for a lie. The truth, the simple truth that no amount of propaganda could completely erase, was waiting for them in a can of peaches. The truth that human life is precious, that survival is not shameful, that nations which care for their soldiers' basic needs are stronger than nations which send them to die on empty stomachs. The truth that freedom, messy and imperfect as it is, creates societies that can mobilize resources and coordinate efforts in ways that authoritarian regimes cannot match. The truth that democracy, for all its flaws, does not demand that its citizens die for abstractions. Some of the Japanese soldiers learned this truth before they died. They learned it too late to save themselves, but perhaps not too late to save future generations from making the same mistake. Masa Hideota, the Okinawan teacher who survived the battle, spent the rest of his life writing and speaking about what he had witnessed. His message was simple. Never again should ideology matter more than life. Never again should young people be taught that death is more beautiful than living. Never again should any government ask its citizens to choose the shattering of the jewel. The grass grows green now over the hills of Okinawa. The caves are silent. The names on the black granite walls face the sea, eternal witnesses to what happens when a nation forgets that its greatest strength is not the willingness of its soldiers to die, but the reasons it gives them to live. 94,000 men chose death. Let us choose to remember them not by glorifying their sacrifice, but by ensuring that no future generation faces such a terrible choice.